The night of the Ashworth Foundation Gala, Renata stood near the entrance of the Royal Ontario Museum's main hall and thought about how strange it was that 800 people could fill a room and somehow make it feel completely empty. She'd been to events like this before. Her firm had catered 3 of them over the past 2 years, but she'd never actually attended one as a guest. Tonight was different. Tonight she was here because her brother-in-law, Preston Ashworth, was being recognized for his contributions to pediatric cancer research, and her sister Donna had called 3 times to make sure Renata wasn't going to back out. She hadn't backed out. She'd worn the blue dress she bought for her cousin's wedding, and hadn't worn since, pinned her dark hair back in the way her mother used to do for her when she was small, and taken the subway because parking downtown on a Friday was a particular kind of madness she refused to participate in. Now she was standing in the entrance hall, with a glass of sparkling water she wasn't drinking, watching 800 people in evening wear perform the elaborate social theatre of pretending they were all deeply glad to see one another. Preston was somewhere in the middle of it, laughing at something a man in a grey suit was saying. Donna was beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, wearing the expression she always wore at these things, pleasant, interested, faintly distant. Renata loved her sister. She also knew that Donna had mastered the art of being present without really being there, and that she was probably thinking about whether she'd remembered to put the slow cooker on before they left. Renata decided to find somewhere quieter to stand. She moved along the edge of the hall, past a series of tall panels displaying photographs of children who had benefited from the Foundation's programs, and found herself near a corridor that led toward the East Wing exhibits. It was darker here, less crowded, and the sound of the string quartet softened to something bearable. That was when she saw the girl. She was sitting on the floor beside one of the exhibit display cases. A low wooden bench had been pushed against the wall nearby, but she wasn't on the bench. She was on the floor, her back against the cool stone, her legs crossed, her hands resting in her lap. She was wearing a dress that someone had put real care into choosing, soft ivory with small flowers embroidered along the neckline, the kind of dress that said someone had stood in a store and thought, "She'll look lovely in this." Her hair was braided carefully, with small pearl pins that caught the light. She looked about 7 years old, maybe 8. She was completely, utterly alone. Renata slowed, then stopped. The girl wasn't crying, she wasn't looking around for someone. She was watching the exhibit in front of her, a display about the geological history of the Canadian Shield. With the focused, self-contained attention of a child who had learned to make her own company. There was something in that posture that Renata recognized from somewhere she couldn't quite name. The particular stillness of a person who has decided not to need anyone nearby. She looked around the corridor. There were a few people moving through it toward the main hall, but none of them so much as glanced at the girl on the floor. A man in a tuxedo walked past close enough that his shoe almost caught the edge of her dress, and he didn't look down. Renata stood where she was for a moment longer. Then she walked over, crouched down so she was at the girl's level, and waited. The girl turned and looked at her. Her eyes were dark brown, very serious. She had a faint scratch along her left cheekbone that was already fading, the kind children get from running through branches or tripping on gravel, and it gave her face a particular quality, like she was someone who moved through the world fast and without apology. Renata smiled at her. The girl looked back steadily and didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. Renata pointed at the display case, the photograph of a rock formation, ancient and grey, with a small placard describing how it had been formed 4 billion years ago, and raised her eyebrows in a question. Interesting. The girl tilted her head. Then she lifted her hands and signed something. Renata felt a small jolt move through her. She recognized sign language when she saw it, though she only knew perhaps 24 words herself. She'd taken a beginner course 4 years ago when one of her kitchen staff had a brother who was deaf, and she'd learned just enough to feel useful, and then forgotten half of it. She watched the girl's hands carefully. The girl had signed, boring, and then, after a beat, she'd added something that Renata thought might be old. Renata laughed, a real one, quiet and surprised, and covered her mouth with her hand. The girl watched her laugh, and something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but close, the edges of it. Renata signed boring back, badly, her fingers clumsy. Then she pointed at herself and shrugged apologetically. The girl's almost smile became a real one, very brief, mostly in her eyes. They sat there for a moment, both of them looking at the 4-billion-year-old rock. Renata reached into her small bag and found what she'd put there out of old habit, a small notebook and a pen, the kind she used to sketch menu ideas in during odd moments. She tore a page from the back and wrote, "My name is Renata. I don't know very much sign language. I'm sorry about that." She handed it to the girl. The girl read it. Then she took the pen from Renata's hand very calmly as though this were a perfectly ordinary transaction and wrote beneath it, "Nora taught me." She said most people don't know it. She handed it back. Renata wrote, "Nora sounds smart. Who is Nora?" The girl, "My mum." "Renata, is your mum here tonight?" A pause. Then, "No, she's at home. I'm here with my uncle. He forgot about me." Renata read those 4 words and felt something move through her chest that she didn't have an easy name for. She wrote, "How long have you been sitting here?" The girl thought about it. Then she held up both hands and spread the fingers. 10. Then she folded all but 2 fingers down on her right hand. 12. She pointed at the floor beneath her. 12 minutes, maybe more. Renata looked back toward the main hall. The sound of conversation rose and fell. The string quartet moved into something more upbeat. And somewhere in there, a man had forgotten about this girl for 12 minutes, while he did whatever people did at events like this. She looked back at the girl. She wrote, "What's your name?" The girl wrote, "Celia." Renata wrote, "Hello, Celia. I'm very glad I found you. That rock is quite boring, isn't it?" Celia read it. This time the smile reached all the way to her face. They sat together on the floor for another few minutes, passing the notebook back and forth. Celia told her, in that careful print of a child who has learned to communicate around limitations, that she was 8 years old, that she liked horses and the color yellow, that she had a cat named Persimmon, that the dress she was wearing had been her idea. Mum said it was too fancy. I said it was perfect, and that the gala was loud and also boring, and also smells like too much perfume. Renata wrote back that she agreed about the perfume, that Persimmon was a wonderful name for a cat, and that the dress was absolutely the right call. Then she heard footsteps moving fast and purposeful down the corridor and looked up. He was tall, maybe mid-30s, dark-haired, and wearing the particular expression of a man who has just realized he's done something terrible and is trying to cross the distance between himself and the mistake as fast as possible, while still appearing composed. He was still dressed for the gala, dark jacket, pale blue tie. But the tie was slightly loosened, and there was something in the way he moved that made her think he'd been genuinely panicked, even if he was working hard not to show it. He stopped when he saw Celia. The relief that moved across his face was so total, so unguarded, that Renata felt she'd accidentally witnessed something private. He came over and crouched down in front of Celia, and his hands moved immediately. Practiced, fluent, clearly someone who had been signing for years. Renata couldn't follow it, but she could read the shape of it. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Are you all right?" Celia looked at him for a long moment. She signed something back, brief, and then glanced at Renata. He followed her gaze. He had grey-green eyes, the kind that looked different depending on the light. And he looked at Renata the way people sometimes do when they're caught between gratitude and embarrassment and haven't decided which one to lead with. "She was alone," Renata said, before she'd decided whether to say anything. "I found her about 15 minutes ago. We were discussing the rock." He blinked. "The rock? The geological display?" Renata nodded toward it. "We agreed it was boring." Something moved through his expression. She thought it was the beginning of something that wasn't quite embarrassment anymore. He stopped. Started again. "I owe you an apology. She's my niece. There was someone I needed to speak with for the program, and I thought I'd be 5 minutes, and then Dr. Fenton pulled me into a conversation that I couldn't." He stopped again, ran a hand over the back of his neck. "That's not an explanation. That's just what happened. I'm sorry." "You don't need to apologize to me," Renata said. "She's the one who was sitting on the floor." He absorbed that. Then he turned back to Celia and signed something, slower this time, and Renata could pick out one word she knew: "Sorry." Celia watched him. Then she reached out and patted his knee once, the way you might pat someone who needed reassurance but was too proud to ask for it, and Renata felt her chest do something inconvenient. The man sat back on his heels. He looked briefly like someone who had been both forgiven and gently humiliated and wasn't entirely sure what to do with either. "My name is Calloway," he said. "Reed Calloway." Renata opened her mouth to say her name. Then she thought of the notebook and handed it to him instead. He looked at the pages. His expression shifted as he read. She'd forgotten what was on them. The full conversation, Celia's careful print mixed with her own, the cat named Persimmon, the too much perfume. And when he looked up again, he was looking at her differently. "Renata," he said, reading her name from the page. "Yes." He handed the notebook back carefully, like it was something worth being careful with. "Thank you." 4. He looked at Celia, who was now pressing her palm against the glass of the display case and examining her own handprint. "For staying with her. She's good company," Renata said. better than most people in that room. He smiled at that, just briefly, just a corner of it, but she saw it. Celia had turned from the display and was signing something at Reed now. Quick and evidently firm, he signed back. She signed again, more emphatically. He looked slightly pained, the expression of someone losing an argument with someone a foot shorter than them. "She wants to know," he said, "if you'll come back to the main hall with us," she says. He paused. "She says you're the only interesting person here, and she doesn't want to lose track of you." Renata looked at Celia, who had fixed her with a look of absolute, unapologetic expectation. She thought about the main hall. The perfume and the noise and the string quartet and 800 people in evening wear. She thought about her sister Donna, somewhere in the middle of it, pleasantly present, and thinking about the slow cooker. She said, "All right." They walked back together, the three of them, Celia between them, with her hand tucked into Reed's arm, and the notebook clutched in her other hand. Renata had the odd feeling of moving through a party she hadn't expected to be at, and finding it had changed shape while she wasn't looking. Preston found them near the edge of the hall, and pumped Reed's hand and said something about the research program. And Donna materialized beside Renata and looked at the three of them together with an expression Renata recognized and chose to ignore. Celia had claimed a chair at the end of one of the smaller tables and was watching the room with the focused, assessing look of someone taking inventory. Every so often she'd turn to Renata and sign something, and Renata would write it in the notebook, and Celia would read the answer and nod, satisfied or dismissive, depending. "Why is that man laughing so loud?" Renata wrote. "He thinks it makes him seem important. Does it? No. Why does that woman keep touching her necklace?" Renata wrote, "I don't know. Maybe she's nervous." About what, being looked at? Or not being looked at? It goes both ways at parties like this. Celia considered that for a long moment, reading it twice. Then she wrote underneath, "That's sad?" Renata looked at the 7 words and found she didn't have anything to add. Reed had pulled a chair up on the other side of Celia, and between them she had begun a running translation project, telling Reed what Renata had written, and then telling Renata what Reed said. It was a laborious and somewhat chaotic system, and it was working perfectly. Reed told Celia something, and Celia wrote it in the notebook and passed it to Renata. He says he learned sign language when she was 4. Their family didn't know anything about it, and he was the one who looked it up. Renata wrote back, "Why him?" She passed it to Celia, who passed it to Reed. He read it. Then he wrote, in handwriting that was less practiced than Celia's but more deliberate, "I don't know. It seemed like the most useful thing I could do." Renata read that twice. The dinner service had begun, and the room rearranged itself around tables. Preston had been placed at the head table near the Foundation's board members. Donna drifted in the same direction. Renata stayed where she was, and no one came to move her, and Reed didn't suggest it. The three of them ate together at the small table at the edge of the room. Celia methodically working through a plate of salmon and roasted vegetables, and at one point stealing a dinner roll from Reed's side plate, without asking, which he pretended not to notice. Renata watched him cut Celia's food into smaller pieces, while carrying on a signed conversation with her, coordinating both tasks with the ease of someone who had done them together many times. And she felt the odd double sensation of seeing something for what it actually was, and wondering what she'd been assuming before. He was not Celia's father, he was the uncle, the one who had forgotten her for 12 minutes in a corridor and run back looking like a man coming apart. She thought those two things together, the forgetting and the running back, and understood they were part of the same person, not contradictions. "She told me you work in food," Reed said during a gap in the notebook exchange. "I have a catering company," Renata said. "Colm Kitchen. We do corporate events, private dinners, some gallery openings. Have you done this kind of thing?" "Gala? Galas? We've catered 3 of the Foundation's events, actually, but always behind the scenes." She looked around the room. "It's different from this side. Better or worse." She thought about it honestly. "I always knew what was happening. Behind the scenes you know where everything is, what comes next, what's going wrong before anyone else does. Out here," she gestured vaguely, "you're just guessing." He nodded, like she'd said something he'd already thought. "What do you do?" she asked. "Structural engineering," he said. "Infrastructure, mostly. Bridges, transit systems." "I did a lot of work on the Eglinton expansion before the project ran into difficulties. I live 2 blocks from a station that's been under construction for 6 years," Renata said. Something crossed his face that was halfway between apology and laughter. "I know. I'm sorry. Are you?" "Professionally very sorry. Personally, I've learned to not go to parties where I might meet people affected by it." And yet, he agreed. Celia had finished her salmon, and was now drawing something on the last few pages of Renata's notebook, apparently having decided her translation duties were complete for the moment. Renata glanced at it and saw she was drawing a horse, a reasonably good one for an 8-year-old, with particular attention paid to the mane. The speeches began after dinner, and the room settled into a comparative quiet. Preston was introduced and stood at the podium looking genuinely moved in a way that reminded Renata of why Donna had married him, whatever her reservations about these events. He spoke about the Foundation's early days, about the children the research had reached, about what it meant to have the support of people willing to show up and keep showing up. Renata listened. Beside her, Reed was interpreting in sign for Celia, his hands moving quietly through the speech. His face mostly still, but his attention absolute. She watched him for a moment. Not the way you watch someone because you've decided to, but the way you sometimes find yourself watching something that is just simply worth watching, and then looked away. Celia reached across and tugged her sleeve. She held up the notebook. She had added Renata to the horse drawing, a figure with dark hair pulled back, standing beside the horse. It was recognizable. Renata pressed her lips together against something. She wrote, "Is that Persimmon?" Celia rolled her eyes so extensively it was almost a full-body experience, and wrote, "Persimmon is a cat. That's Maple." Renata wrote, "You have a horse named Maple?" "No, I want a horse named Maple. It's different." "Renata, what does your mum say about Maple?" Celia wrote, "She says maybe when I'm 12. How long until you're 12? 4 years, that's a long time." Celia looked at that for a moment. Then she wrote, very carefully, like someone stating a position they'd thought through, "I can wait." Renata read it and thought, yes, this one can wait. This one is going to be fine. After the speeches, the room loosened again and people began to move around. Reed had gone to speak to someone from the Foundation board. A brief conversation, 10 minutes at most, and this time, before he left, he signed to Celia and pointed at Renata, and Celia had nodded with the gravity of someone accepting a formal responsibility. She took it seriously. She stayed beside Renata and didn't drift. And when a server came past with a tray of T4s, she looked at Renata first before taking one. "Go ahead," Renata told her, and then remembered and wrote it. Donna found her while Reed was gone and stood beside her and didn't say anything for almost a full minute, which was how Renata knew she was building to something. "She's lovely," Donna said finally. "Yes, he seems very good with her." "Yes, he's not married," Donna said. "In case you were wondering." "I wasn't," Renata said. "You weren't not wondering either," Donna said pleasantly, and drifted away before Renata could answer. Reed came back and Celia produced the notebook and showed him the drawing. He looked at it for a moment, the horse named Maple, the figure with dark hair beside it. And then he looked at Renata and she felt caught at something she hadn't known she was doing. "She's drawn you into the horse's future," he said. "Apparently, that's significant. She's been planning Maple for approximately 3 years. The guest list is very selective." "I'm honored," Renata said, and meant it more than she expected to. The evening was winding toward its end. People had begun the gradual drift toward the exits, the particular momentum of an event that had been good enough to stay for, and was now conclusively over. Preston was doing his last rounds of handshakes. Donna was checking her phone, which meant the slow cooker question had been answered one way or another. Celia had fallen asleep. She had done it with the efficiency of a child who had decided the evening was finished. She'd folded herself sideways in the chair, tucked her hands under her cheek, and simply gone. Reed had moved his jacket around her shoulders without waking her, a gesture so practiced that Renata thought it probably wasn't the first time. They sat in the quiet that had settled at the edge of the emptying hall, Celia asleep between them. "Her mother, your sister?" Renata said, keeping her voice low. "Younger sister, Nora." He said the name the way you say the name of someone you've been worrying about. "She had a difficult year. She's doing better now, but she wasn't up for tonight. Celia's been. She handles it." "She handles a lot. 8 years old," Renata said. "Yes." She didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't be either insufficient or too much. Reed looked at the sleeping girl beside him, and then out at the last of the departing crowd, and then at Renata. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know I'm aware it may be slightly unusual given the circumstances." She waited. "Would you be willing to give me your number," he said, "so that I can call you not?" He paused. "I mean, yes, because I'd like to, but also because Celia has apparently decided you're important and she's going to ask about you. And I'd rather be able to tell her you're findable than explain why I didn't ask." Renata considered that for a moment, the honesty of it, the slight absurdity of it, the fact that it was very nearly the most straightforward thing anyone had said to her in a long time. She said, "Give me the notebook." He found it on the table and handed it over. She opened it to the last blank page, past the horse, past the geological notes, past the full accounting of a conversation between a woman who barely knew sign language and an 8-year-old girl who'd decided the rock was boring, and wrote her number. She handed it back. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. "I'll tell Celia she's findable," he said. "Good," Renata said. "Tell her I'm still thinking about Maple." He didn't quite smile, but it was very close. She had started to think that was just how his face worked, that the almost smiles were the ones that counted. Celia stirred then and opened her eyes and looked from one of them to the other with the uncanny accuracy of a child who has been awake longer than she's letting on. She signed something at Reed, and Reed made a sound that was almost a laugh and looked at the ceiling. "What did she say?" Renata asked. He looked back down. "She said, 'Finally.'" Renata looked at Celia, who had resettled herself in the chair, and was examining her pearl hairpins with the performance of someone who had absolutely not just been monitoring the conversation. She picked up the pen and wrote in the notebook, on the page with her number beneath it. "Good night, Celia." She passed it to the girl. Celia read it. She looked up. She signed one thing, small and precise, and Reed didn't translate it because he didn't need to. Renata had remembered enough from 4 years ago to know what "see you soon" looked like. She signed it back, badly. Celia grinned, full and sudden, the way children do when they've gotten exactly what they came for. The museum was almost empty by the time they reached the front entrance. The night air cool and carrying the particular freshness of a Toronto spring that hadn't decided yet whether it was done with winter. Celia walked between them in her embroidered dress, her borrowed jacket, her pearl pins catching the light from the entrance above. At the top of the steps, she stopped and turned and signed something to Reed. He said, "She wants me to tell you that Persimmon will probably like you," Renata said. "Probably. Persimmon is very particular. But Celia says it's very likely. I'll take it." Celia seemed satisfied with that. She took Reed's hand and they went down the steps together, and Renata watched them until they reached the car. A sensible grey sedan, the kind of car that is chosen by someone who thinks about practical things. And Reed settled Celia into the back seat and buckled her in and closed the door gently. And then he looked back once at the top of the steps where Renata still stood. He raised his hand. Not quite a wave, something quieter. She raised hers back. Then he got in, and the car pulled away into the city. And Renata stood at the top of the steps of the Royal Ontario Museum in the blue dress she'd bought for her cousin's wedding, holding a notebook with a horse in it, and found that she was already looking forward to the phone ringing.